As a cake business, we would all love a compliment or a great review, which goes a long way to establish credibility and boost confidence in the business of cake making. But what happens if you get the dreaded complaint that you're not looking forward to addressing? Look, I've received some great reviews in my time as a cake maker, but I had the odd complaint that hasn't been a great feeling, and I have had to deal with it. So actually, I am redecorating a lemon cake that I started on a live session. It's a rustic cake. I'm not completely happy with it because buttercream cakes are a struggle for me, but the cake reminds me of once upon a time when I had a terrible experience of a cake that resulted in a complaint and how I dealt with this. This follows one of the last videos about the cake tasting session and of course the interest of customers and dealing with disappointments in cake making. So if you want to see those videos, I'll link them in the description box for you to check out, just so that you can follow up and see what some of the issues are that you have to deal with or address sometimes in a business. So let's get to my work table, handle this redecoration process whilst I talk you through what happened with this particular cake, what brought about the complaint, and what I did to actually resolve this. And fun fact, I have remained in great relations with the customer. They have been great. So going from an issue that could have ended terribly to maintaining positive relationships with the customer who is due another cake from me not too long from now means there's a great outcome. So let me hand you the tips on how to handle this, so when you get a complaint you can deal with it with all the confidence. Let's go. A quick overview of what's happening here. So I made this cake as part of a live tutorial during which I showed and discussed my struggle with buttercream cakes in detail. This cake was supposed to be a rustic cake with focus on the simplistic details of the buttercream texture and the flowers, but I was unhappy with it after the tutorial and decided to scrape the buttercream off initially to create a shorts video, and still unhappy with that after scraping off the buttercream and resetting the flowers. I decided again to reset the flowers and the entire decorative details for a better look, but I realize now this is more an issue in my head than it is a real issue with the cake itself. So indulge me whilst I get through this and discuss the horrid moment I received the complaint. I received this email sometime last year. I was headed home from church when I looked over the notification on my phone's screen and my heart sank. This email had come from a couple whose wedding cake I had set up the day before. I'd also discussed them in a previous video about their cake tasting, during which I had literally a poop explosion at my door. Maybe that should have been a sign, but I wasn't to know. But in all fairness, the email was generally positive, except for the detail that said the bottom tier of their cake was ruined. The message came from the bride, who was generally laid back, and as a couple they were super kind and considerate in all the decisions they made about their wedding cake and wanted their guests to have a great experience. This was a sentiment that led their wedding cake process. So for this reason, I was super gutted and almost couldn't contain my disappointment for them and of course for myself when this issue arose. Taking a quick break to let you know that discussing complaints in the wedding cake business is not as formal as you would have in a corporate setting. I'm quite aware that sometimes this video may come across to people who have no idea about the business of cakes. However, being a home baker, different settings have different policies and formalities for dealing with issues and complaints. As a home baker, generally your complaints will come so informally but has to be taken seriously, and before you do anything, especially when you are set up as a business, is to ensure that your terms and conditions are solid. These are the things that will prescribe certain scenarios as a business and how you are going to handle these. So for instance, if you have a customer, their responsibility in the cake making process and also yours as a business. So there are issues with mitigated liabilities and all of that. A lot of technicalities. It's not fun and games when you're thinking about those legalities in terms of running a business, but it is important to have an understanding that even as a home baker, you have certain legal requirements to handling issues with customers for their satisfaction. I also know that as a business, when when you're dealing with customers who are indulging or purchasing such emotive elements such as cakes, sometimes you have to remain flexible. However, I will still encourage you to ensure that your terms and conditions are very solid. I have my terms and conditions on the website, a copy of which is sent via link to the customer on the purchase and invoicing of their cake, and by making a payment they are also accepting the terms of my business. So when such issues arise, I have to go to my terms and conditions and look at where the scenario or issue is and the prescriptions that relates to handling these issues. Thankfully, I haven't had issues that will require having to resort to my terms and conditions. I tend to lead with a lot of humanity, and especially in this case where there wasn't really a specific clear-cut decision on what really happened with the cake, who was at fault and all of that. But then it was also important to consider the day, which is a bride's wedding day. No matter what your terms and conditions are, you don't want to be the person responsible for a terrible experience on such a happy and momentous day. So, my heart sank, but I had to lead with knowing that I really didn't want to be the person who had contributed to making a bad day for this bride, and worst case, I was going to drag them through the legalities. So let's get to my work table and we'll continue the cake, and I'll show you my response, how we handled this issue and the resolve we eventually had. A year later, I still feel my heart sinks when I'm tackling this issue, but in the spirit of honesty, I want to bring you some of the real details of the cake making business and how customer issues can be resolved, because if it hasn't happened to you, hopefully it never has to happen, but sooner or later something is going to happen and you're going to need all the help to solve this.
Before we get into the resolution of this issue, let's make a pit stop to discuss some of the boring details of my terms and conditions, now scrolling on screen alongside the photo of the cake in question. My terms and conditions covers all aspects of running my business, as well as setting out the conditions that relates to certain issues that may arise and how this is resolved. For the subject matter at hand, I'll be focusing on the relevant aspects that applies, which falls under the subject of the edible quality of the cake. The customer complaints were about the texture of the cake, for which they weren't even sure about but chose not to eat the cake following precaution. The details of how such a complaint should be made and how this is handled is noted on screen, and I'd like to think the customer actually followed every detail and adhered to the processes that are prescribed in the terms and conditions. However, as stated, this was a wedding cake and I had established a very positive relationship with the couple, who were extremely gracious with their complaint, which, if I'm being honest, was hardly a complaint. It was more like they were trying to notify me of a concern, which, despite my disappointment, I really did appreciate. I did eventually respond to the concern a day after I received the email, which will be on screen shortly. But before you handle a complaint from a client, there are a few tips you need to note just so that it can yield you some positive outcome. So as a business, dealing with complaint can be difficult and sometimes unsettling. So besides your terms and conditions, when you receive a complaint, make sure you step away from the situation to consider your first options properly before you engage, and try to avoid the need to be defensive where possible. Also, handle the issue outside of your own biases, perhaps seeking a second opinion. And cake business groups are a great resource for this, where you can get some second opinion from business owners who handle these on some occasional basis. Whilst you may want to maintain the appearance of a business and stand your ground, in cases of conflict, try to see the customer's point of view, where especially their complaint is upheld following the noted terms. Finally, where possible, try and let the right rules apply, and also apply some humanity.
Considering all the circumstances of this matter and following my own terms of business, I made the decision to offer the couple a full refund of their cake according to the total servings missed. I also offered them some extra alongside just to make up for the negative outcome. Surprisingly, the couple declined the refund, insisting despite the issue with their cake, they had a great experience which was still worthwhile. Hence, a refund wasn't necessary. Now, that blew me away and was beyond what I was expecting of them. In part, their grace and considerate nature stood tall throughout the process, even in light of the issues with their cake. While I noted in a previous video that running a business is about profits and making money, I also insisted that choosing the right people with similar values to serve in a business is important, and that should not be put before the decision about money, especially in the case of making such an extremely sensitive item such as a wedding cake. I discussed that subject in a video that is showing on screen, and alongside that is the couple's tasting session, which has the unsavory subject of the poop explosion. I encourage you to watch both, and I'll see you in my next video. Thanks for watching.